Hey there and welcome back to another Dragon Prince video. And today, I want to continue to complain about the show. I know, toxic, but whatever, the latest season just didn't do it for me. For many different reasons. Last time, we talked about the car crash that was the relationship between Callum and Rayla, and this time, we're going to be exploring another of our main characters. The Boy King, Ezran, and how in Season 4, he kind of sucked. Not like he was a bad person or anything, but he was written terribly and completely sucked me out of things, which, was a massive shame, as I think he was a character who had one of the more interesting arcs throughout the show's first 3 seasons. And so, I guess, here's where we go through that a little bit. When we first meet Ezran, he's a pretty typical sort of cheeky yet sweet prince type character. He loves his jelly tarts, he loves his brother, his father, Bait, and he's basically the darling of the castle. He's not really spoiled or entitled, but very kind and generous. The perfect heir to the throne, really. Even though he does seem to shun that responsibility somewhat. But then, his father's attacked. And Callum and Ezran escape through the castle alongside one of the assassins, Rayla, with the egg of the Dragon Prince, and begin their trek to Xadia to return it to the Dragon Queen and bring peace to the kingdom again. And remember, at first, he didn't actually know that his dad was dead, so he goes on this reckless quest to try and help his people and fix things. He bonds with Rayla, he deepens his brotherly bond with Callum, and he becomes best friends with the newly hatched Zim. Until all this happy harmony all comes crashing down around him as he learns that his father actually died, and that he was killed in the assassination attempt, not wounded like he expected. And thus, he realizes that he's now the rightful king, and he needs to return to the kingdom to govern Catullus. And so, he's forced to leave his brother and his friends to their quest, and go back home, where he immediately begins to try to secure peace between the elves and the human kingdoms. And of course, this doesn't really work out too well for him, and he's pretty much manipulated into giving up his crown to Viren and is locked away, whilst Viren has many of the kings and queens of the human realms assassinated to ensure that all the kingdoms mobilize their armies to fight against the threat posed by Xadia. When, in reality, he just wants to be able to harvest Zim's power for himself. Ezran breaks free, he aids his friends and family, and in the end, he reunites Zim with his mother, bringing peace between Xadia and humanity, and opening up a new era of reconciliation between the various different cultures of the world. It was a good early arc for him. He grows quite a lot in very interesting ways. When you first see him, he's cheeky and goofy, and he doesn't really understand the responsibilities that he has. He's reckless, which is a big reason as to why he thinks it's a good idea to go with an assassin to return the egg of the Dragon Prince to Xadia, when humans are banned from Xadia under pain of death. Over the course of the first saga, he learns to be responsible. He quickly takes charge of looking after the egg and becomes the moral compass of the group. He pushes them on for the good of the world, whilst also somehow turning into their sounding board and emotional support animal. Not bad for a kid, eh? He sees the good in other people, and through his relationships with Rayla and Zim, he realizes that there's no wrong side in this conflict, that elves and humans and dragons, ultimately they're all the same, and they shouldn't be fighting at all. And when he returns to rule over the kingdom after his father's confirmed death, he begins to apply these principles in the way that he rules his kingdom, advocating for reconciliation and peace with the elves despite the death of his father, advocating for forgiveness. And then, in the ultimate Chad move, at least in my eyes, when it seems like his peaceful principles are going to lead to more violence and bloodshed within the kingdom, he relinquishes his crown to Viren, whom he'd had arrested earlier, and allows himself to be locked up instead, all to prevent needless lives being lost. Of course, this all then backfires in his face when Viren murders the other rulers and whips their new leaders into a frenzy, declaring all-out war on Xadia and marching on the Stormspire. Ezran escapes, he joins the fight, and you know the rest. And so, you'd assume that based on all of these experiences, which happened over a short period of time, and the fact that you have a pretty decent time skip between the events of the Stormspire and the beginning of the latest season, you'd think there'd be a pretty significant shift in the way Ezran would be portrayed, the way he'd be written, the way he'd act, right? I mean, the kid's now been king for a couple of years, and his early years were marred by the death of his father and some pretty harsh life lessons. A war, a coup, his surrogate uncle betraying him, going crazy and trying to have him killed. Pretty life-defining moments that should shape him to be a more serious and driven character, whilst also retaining those softer elements that made him so likeable and accessible to begin with. But then we come to the latest season, and it feels like Ezran, just like a lot of other characters, has very much become a bit stagnant, at least in terms of his arc and personality. It's like the story just hits a pause button on Ezran, and instead of him continuing to develop in the 3 years that it's been since he last appeared, he kind of just grows into a slightly bigger body with none of the personality shift. The reality is, based on his personality, he should have become a wiser than his years type of character, who's under a lot of strain due to being a child king. I feel like if written well, this would manifest in him losing a lot of that fluffy cinnamon bun energy that he had early on, perhaps becoming a little bit more abrupt. And I'm not saying he needs to turn into some closed off and cold asshole type character. Not what I'm saying. But a more Harrow type of person, where he has that undercurrent of kindness and silliness, whilst also having that brooding intensity that can lash out in anger, like when he puts Viren in his place. I just feel like this is what Ezran should have been shaped into over the time skip, because it shows the cost of being the king, and the price of inheriting the crown way too early, and what that can do to your mental health. But instead, it's almost like he's been Flanderized. I mean, he's all smiles all the time. He doesn't seem bothered by the crown. He has a minister for crusts and jellies. Like, I figured when he brought that guy in, he was going to be minister for peasants or something like that, but... Plus, he can't even go long without busting out an inspirational speech, which just doesn't have the same effect. He feels like fake Katara from the Ember Islands Players episode. And on top of that, I think his personal arc was kind of mishandled as well. I think a big part of his storyline should have been about the responsibility of the crown, the burden of ruling. He should want to go with Zim and Callum and Rayla on a grand adventure, but he can't, because he's the king and he needs to stay behind and actually be the king. This in turn would create some interesting narrative contrast between him and Zim, because we see Zim repeating Ezran's arc from previously, the prince who runs away for the adventure to try and help bring peace, whereas Ezran's been there and he's done that, and now he needs to be more responsible, to lead his people in an important time. And this would have also freed Ezran up for a storyline of his own, one that actually exists in the show right now, but a storyline that was severely lacking. The Sun Elves political storyline, ugh. I feel like that story, where the elves and the humans are being forced to work together, and there are cultural conflicts, this would have been the perfect place for him to properly appear as the king, working with Janai to try and find a true solution to the conflicts between their people. It adds more drama, more stakes. In the original, it's framed as a Sun Elves internal issue, made more complicated by the engagement between Janai and Amaya. But you add in Ezran to this, and suddenly it's so much heavier, and with much deeper implications. If they kill the woman, is this going to mean war? What's Ezran's perspective on the issue going to be? How will he work the political side of things? That storyline just has a big Ezran-sized hole in it, and I think it would have made his arc and that tedious storyline much better if he'd been involved. He's a major character. They are mostly B-list characters, let's be honest. That arc needed some star power to carry it, and they just didn't have it. And since Ezran hardly did anything of note this season, I feel like it would have worked well. Plus, it frees up Callum and Rayla to actually have to work on their issues, as their peacekeeper/buffer zone character is gone. And so, yeah, ultimately, Ezran was among my favourite characters in the early days of The Dragon Prince. He had such a richly developed arc, exciting and fun, but in the end, this season, he really fell off the wagon hard. He feels stagnant and Flanderized, like he's there as token moral support and not much else. And ultimately, that's a massive shame, as I really think he had so much more potential than that. But yeah, there really isn't that much more to say, other than I hope his arc improves going forward. And so yeah, that's all I have to say. And so I'll just quickly remind you that these have just been my opinions, and now I'd like to hear yours. What did you think of Ezran and his arc this season? Do you think I'm on the money here, or maybe I'm wrong? I'm curious for your thoughts, so make sure to like, comment, subscribe, and let me know.